The world is largely divided into rice-eating countries and bread-eating countries, and the most tangible result of rice and wheat is population. In 2022, the world's population exceeded 8 billion people. According to the United Nations, a baby born on November 15, 2022, in the Dominican Republic is the official 8 billionth person. Of the world's 8 billion people, 4.8 billion, or 60%, live in Asia. China and India, two of the most populous countries, are also located in Asia. These two countries have a combined population of about 2.8 billion people, meaning that for every 10 people born, 3.5 of them are Indian or Chinese. Beyond India and China, Asia is home to many other population powerhouses. Indonesia, the world's fourth most populous country with 280 million people, and Pakistan, the world's fifth most populous country with 240 million people, are also located in Asia. Of the top 5 most populous countries in the world, all but the United States are in Asia. Additionally, Bangladesh with 170 million people, Japan and the Philippines with 120 million people, Vietnam with 100 million people, and Thailand with 70 million people are all in Asia. All of these countries have one very obvious thing in common: rice is a staple food. In Europe, on the other hand, where bread is the staple food, there are only 740 million people. That's 9% of the world's population, and only about a seventh of Asia's population. Even if you add up all of Europe's population, it's about half the population of India or China. Of those, only Russia, which is barely even Europe, has a population of over 100 million. Only Germany, the United Kingdom, France, and Italy have a population over 50 million. There are several reasons for this stark difference in population between the two continents. First, there's a huge difference in the size of the two continents' land masses. Asia is 4.5 times larger than Europe, which means it can support more people and produce food from more farmland. Large-scale epidemics are also a factor in the population differences between the two continents. Europe has experienced significant population losses during regular outbreaks of the Black Death, cholera, and flu. Asia has also seen its share of epidemics, but not to the extent that Europe has. Europe's flat terrain and frequent wars and trade resulted in a lot of population movement, which led to a lot of wipeout-level epidemics. Since the 30 Years' War, a religious war in the 17th century, Europe has seen several very large-scale international wars. In the 18th century, Europe had more than 1,000 independent kingdoms, and the number of people who died in the wars between them cannot even be counted. In Asia, local wars were constant, but there were few large-scale international wars like the ones in Europe, which saved lives. But there's another reason that matters most. It's the grain people eat as a staple food. In other words, the population gap between Asia and Europe is the difference between the population-boosting power of rice and wheat. Although studies vary depending on the conditions and environment, before the invention of chemical fertilizers, rice had 10 times the ability to support the population of wheat. As wheat farming techniques have improved and chemical fertilizers have become more common, this gap has narrowed slightly, but rice is still 3 times as productive as wheat. In many parts of Southeast Asia, rice could even be double-cropped, meaning that barley and rice could be grown in sequence on the same plot of land. Wheat, on the other hand, is very fertility of soil consuming, requiring the land to be rested regularly. In many ways, rice had an advantage over wheat when it came to feeding people. Furthermore, rice has a very important characteristic: the more labor you put into it, the greater the yield. Also, rice farming required 3 times as much water as wheat farming, so large-scale irrigation was a necessity. So, in the East, water was always important. If you were good with water, you could be a king, like King Wu in Xia Dynasty, China. Irrigation was not something that could be done by 1 or 2 laborers, so the only way to make up for the lack of labor was to have lots of children. Sons were preferred over daughters because they were stronger, and this became known as boy preference. It was also advantageous to marry early in order to have as many children as possible, which later evolved into a culture of early marriage. As the population grew, more people needed to farm to support them, which required more labor, which required more children. Eventually, after 10,000 years of this cycle, Asia became overpopulated. What's more, Asia had more of a compounding effect because they started growing rice about 2,000 to 3,000 years earlier than Europe did. So by the early 16th century, China already had over 100 million people, and India had even more, about 110 million. By contrast, the population of all of Western Europe at this time was less than 60 million, and it wasn't until the end of the 18th century that it reached 100 million, and even then, it was only because they had access to new crops like corn and potatoes from Central and South America. As Europe expanded into Asia during the Age of Discovery, it belatedly realized the difference between the population-sustaining power of rice and wheat. As a result, Enlightenment scholars in the 18th century advised Europe to grow rice, and later, as the importance of population grew, so did the interest in rice. Adam Smith of England said, "The measure of the wealth and power of a nation is the number of its people." And Adolf Hitler of Germany said, "In the end, the population determines the fate of a nation." However, Europe's sunlight and rainfall were insufficient to support rice farming.